Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. We're going to continue our reading and discussion of the book Codeword Barbelon by P.D. Stewart, the chapter entitled The Day the Towers Fell. What, why, when, and how. The preceding chapters of this book are going to prove, beyond any reasonable doubt, that 9/11 was an inside job. It was conducted by our own government, and particularly Roman Catholic apologists in our government, high-level Knights of Malta and Freemasons, for the purpose of transforming America into the image of the beast. And if you think that thesis sounds outrageous, I'm sure that after listening to these next few chapters, your mind will come to a far different conclusion. The evidence is overwhelming, and I think we all need to take heed. 9/11 led up to a Holy Roman Crusade, and it's going to be fought not only overseas, but within the borders of this country. The United States is on the precipice of a revolutionary change. Gone is going to be the Constitution of the United States and all of our Protestant liberties, and in its replacement will be Roman Catholic a Roman Catholic social order and a fascist government. Now, we're going to back up one paragraph for continuity purposes. I'm reading at the bottom of page 401 in the book if you're following along. The author says, according to the official 9/11 Commission report, quote, Atta had been selected by CAPPS in Portland, and three members of his hijacking team, Sagami, Wael al-Shari, and Walid al-Shari were selected in Boston. Yet their selection affected only the handling of their checked bags, not their screening at the checkpoint. All five men cleared the checkpoint and made their way to the gate for American Flight 11. Atta, Omari, and Sagami took their seats in business class, seats 8D, 8G, and 10B, respectively. The Shari brothers had adjacent seats in row 2. Wael in 2A, Walid in 2B, in the first class cabin. They boarded American Flight 11 between 7:31 and 7:40 a.m., unquote. The Hamzi brothers were selected for extra scrutiny by the airline's customer service representative because, according to the 9/11 Commission report, quote, one of the brothers did not have photo identification, nor could he understand English, and because the agent found both of the passengers to be suspicious. And yet the only consequence of their selection was that their checked bags were held off the plane until it was confirmed that they had boarded the aircraft, unquote. Quoting further, who were those people anyway, asks publicaction.com. Before September 11th, the combined forces of the United States military and domestic intelligence, that is the CIA, the FBI, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, were clueless that such a catastrophic event would occur. Yet a day or so later, the FBI had secured the names and mugshots of each of the 19 hijackers. How did the FBI know who the hijackers were? After all, every single one of the eyewitnesses were dead. How did the FBI distinguish between quote-unquote regular Muslims and hijacker Muslims on those flights? Did they just go through the passenger list calling out the Muslim-sounding names and labeling the people bearing those names as hijackers? Carol A. Valentine, writing for publicaction.com, says, quote, on September 30th, I looked at the passenger lists of those 4 flights. To my surprise, the list contained none of the hijackers' names, unquote. Here are the URLs checked by Public Action, and it lists them here, and if you buy the book, you can look these up for yourself. Now, Public Action again says, quote, as late as February 3rd, 2002, United Airlines displayed on its website a copy of its September 12, 2001 press release issued days before the alleged hijackers were identified. The press release listed all the passengers on Flight 175 and 93 on September 11, 2001. The names of the alleged hijackers did not appear, and United Airlines could not have removed them, for the quote-unquote hijackers had not yet been identified. So clearly, none of the hijackers were aboard those 2 flights, asserts publicaction.com. On February 3rd of 2003, the United Airlines press release was located at this website, and it gives the URL so that you can check it up yourself. And it continues, but it has since been removed. Luckily, the press release was also cached at www.publicaction.com/911/UA passenger list. The photos below, given here in the book, are from a closed-circuit television camera in the Pentagon's parking area showing something impacting against the Pentagon's walls on 9/11/2001. However, as can be seen, these images show absolutely no sign of American Airlines Flight 77. And it gives captions underneath the photographs of the Pentagon impact. It says impact. But where is American Airlines Flight 77? Where is the debris from the plane, the wings, the wheels, the engines, the propellers, the tail fin, or something to show a plane passed through it there? And also another photograph. It says World Affairs BBC News website on 17 May 2006 says, we can see the plane comes into view at the far right. Do you see it? Where is the plane? There's no plane in view. That's right, the familiar still frame photograph of a closed-circuit television camera within the parking lot of the Pentagon shows no airplane, and yet they insist that an airplane is visible in the photograph. And then another photograph of the facade of the Pentagon after it had collapsed. The question, the caption under the photograph, quite a lot of damage, but not a piece of wreckage from American Airlines Flight 77, said to have been flown into the Pentagon. In order for a plane to crash that low into the building, there would have to have been tracks left on the ground in front of the point of impact. No such tracks here. This plane must have fallen from the skies just at the point of impact. Look, the ground is virtually untouched. Look, no wing damage on the sides of the building, building walls on either side of the point of impact. The wings should have caused some damage to these walls. It looks like this plane had no wings, like a missile, says the caption. And it concludes, these people are playing mind games with the American public and the rest of the world. And it is true. Now, the author continues, he says, so we have read the facts, the allegations, the denials and counter-allegations of, quote, outrageous conspiracy theories, unquote. But what is the truth? Luckily for our investigation, within minutes of the impact of the first plane to hit the World Trade Towers, Twin Towers, news media from all over the city of New York had their cameras trained on the World Trade Center buildings. This means that they had photos of the attack from all angles, as well as live on-the-spot statements from survivors and first responders. This, as we shall see shortly, has proved invaluable. And now the author is going to continue with Chapter 59 of the book. It's entitled Strange Explosions, The Secret Dossier, 9/11 That Contradicts the Official Report. Begins with a quote, "We heard what sounded like a loud explosion, and then Tower 2 started coming down," unquote. That's from New York Fire Department Battalion Chief John Sudnick. Another quote, "Boom, boom, 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 and that's how the tower came down." The author begins by saying 10 massive buildings were destroyed on 9/11, along with a large number of cars and oil tankers that were set on fire and pulverized. As David Griffin correctly observed, most of the testimonies about the phenomenal collapse of the towers on 9/11 had been available shortly after the events from reporters. Now here the author gives us a note, and I'm going to read this note. NBC's Pat Dawson reported from the World Trade Center on the morning of 9/11 that he had been told by Albert Turey, the fire department's deputy assistant chief of safety, that, quote, "another explosion took place an hour after the first crash in one of the towers here," unquote. A Wall Street Journal reporter said, quote, "I heard this roar, looked up, and saw individual floors, one after the other, exploding outward. I thought to myself, my God, they're going to bring the building down. And they, whoever they are, had set charges. I saw the explosions." BBC reporter Steve Evans said, quote, "I was at the base of the second tower that was hit. There was an explosion. The base of the building shook. When we were outside, the second explosion happened, and then there was a series of explosions." This was reported by the BBC on September 11, 2001. It was an inside job. There were multiple successive explosions in both towers long after the airplanes impacted. Again, it says, as David Griffin correctly observed, most of the testimonies about the phenomenal collapse of the towers on 9/11 had been available shortly after the events from reporters, firefighters, police officers, and people who worked in the towers. Within minutes of the attacks, New York City's 9/11 system was flooded with calls from eyewitnesses giving their accounts of the event. Most callers correctly identified the target of the attack. Some identified the plane as a commercial airliner. Soon after the attack, the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks upon the United States, also known as the 9/11 Commission, an independent, they said, bipartisan commission, was established by congressional legislation and signed by President George W. Bush in late 2002. The commission's remit was to investigate the events of 9/11. It closed its investigation on August 21, 2004. The Commission's charter was to prepare a full and complete account of the circumstances surrounding September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks. But did it? In his second 9/11 book, entitled The 9/11 Commission Report, Omissions and Distortions, Ray Griffin claims to have identified scores of lies and omissions in the 9/11 report. Here are just a few of the 115 omissions and errors that Griffin says he found in the 9/11 Commission's report and which he portrays as lies. Number 1, the omission of evidence that at least 6 of the alleged hijackers, including Wali al-Shari, said by the Commission probably to have stabbed a flight attendant on Flight 11 before it crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center, are still alive. Number 2, the obfuscation of the evidence that Hani Hanjour was too poor a pilot to have flown an airliner into the Pentagon. Number 3, the omission of the fact that the publicly released flight manifest contained no Arab names. Number 4, the omission of the fact that fire has never before or after 9/11 caused steel frame buildings to collapse. Number 5, the omission of the fact that World Trade Center Building 7, which was not hit by an airplane and which had only small localized fires, also collapsed, an occurrence that FEMA admitted could not be explained. Number 6, the omission of the fact that the collapse of Twin Towers, like that of Building 7, exemplified at least 10 features suggestive of controlled demolition. Number 7, the claim that the core of each of the Twin Towers as, quote, a hollow steel shaft, unquote, a claim that denied the existence of the 47 massive steel columns that in reality constituted the core of each of the towers, and that given the pancake theory of collapses should have still been sticking up many hundreds of feet in the air. Number 8, the omission of Larry Silverstein's statement that he and the fire department commander decided to, quote-unquote, pull Building 7. And the word pull is used in the demolition industry to designate a demolition. The word pull means to demolish by explosive force. Number 9, the omission of the fact that the steel from the World Trade Center buildings was quickly removed from the crime scene and shipped overseas before it could be analyzed for evidence of explosives. Number 11, the omission of the fact that President Bush's brother, Marvin, and his cousin, Wirt Walker III, were both principals in the company in charge of security for the World Trade Center. Number 12, the omission of any discussion of whether the damage done to the Pentagon was consistent with the impact of a Boeing 757 going several hundred miles per hour. Number 13, the omission of the fact that there are photographs showing that the West Wing's facade did not collapse until 30 minutes after the strike, and also that the entrance hole appears too small for a Boeing 757 to have entered. Number 14, the omission of all testimony that has been used to cast doubt on whether remains of a Boeing 757 were visible either inside or outside the Pentagon. Number 15, the omission of the fact that pictures from various security cameras, including the camera at the gas station across from the Pentagon, the film from which was reportedly confiscated by the FBI immediately after the strike, could presumably answer the question of what really hit the Pentagon. Number 16, the omission of Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld's reference to, quote, the missile used to damage the Pentagon, unquote. Number 17, the omission of reports that both Mayor Willie Brown and some Pentagon officials received warnings about flying on 9/11. Number 18, the omission of news stories suggesting that after 9/11, the United States military in Afghanistan deliberately allowed Osama bin Laden to escape. Number 19, The omission of the fact that President Bush and other members of his administration repeatedly spoke of the 9/11 attacks as, quote, opportunities, unquote. Number 20, the claim that Flight 77 flew almost 40 minutes through American airspace towards Washington without being detected by the military's radar. And I have to comment further. Anybody who has any idea of what security apparati that are in place on the eastern seaboard surely cannot believe the official report. The idea that wide-bodied, heavy, complex commercial airplanes could loiter around in eastern seaboard airspace undetected and unmolested by the American government, the military, is untenable. The eastern seaboard of the United States, particularly in the areas of New York City and Washington, D.C., are the heaviest monitored airspace anywhere in the world. The idea that these airplanes could loiter around our skies for 40 minutes without any molestation by scrambled military jet aircraft is untenable. Number 21, the endorsement of two contradictory stories about the aircraft that hit the Pentagon. One in which it executed a 330-degree downward spiral, in other words, a high-speed dive, and another in which there is no mention of this maneuver. Number 22, the omission of all the evidence suggesting that the aircraft that hit the Pentagon was not Flight 77. Ray Griffin closes his impressive list of omissions by concluding, quote, far from lessening suspicions about official complicity, the 9/11 report has served to confirm them. Why would the minds in charge of this final report engage in such deception if they were not trying to cover up very high crimes, unquote? And a reference from page 291 of his book. Now, under the subtitle, What the Eyewitnesses Heard and Saw on 9/11, P.D. Stewart writes, there were many credible eyewitness testimonies of the events of 9/11. Shortly after 9/11, the New York Fire Department recorded over 500 oral histories in which firefighters and emergency medical workers recounted their experiences of that day. Mayor Bloomberg, however, refused to release these testimonies for reasons only he and his advisors know. It was only after the New York Times, joined by several families of the 9/11 victims, had filed lawsuit that the New York Court of Appeals ordered the city to disclose the bulk of these eyewitness reports. This was done in August of 2005, according to our New York Times Dwyer's article, hereinafter designated NYT. Since then, they've been publicly available, according to the New York Times in 2005. What follows are just a few of these eyewitness testimonies, including those of several New York City fire chiefs and police officers who reported hearing, quote-unquote, explosive devices going off in all the World Trade Center buildings immediately before and during their spectacular collapse. Going to begin now by reading direct eyewitness testimony from principal civil service employees in the New York City area. First, the author begins by quoting Assistant Commissioner for New York City, Stephen Gregory, who said, quote, I thought before Tower Number 2 came down that I saw low-level flashes. I saw flash, flash, flash at the lower level of the building. You know, like when they demolish a building, unquote. That was reported in the New York Times the 12th of August, 2005. It was entitled Oral History of Stephen Gregory, page 14 through 16. Captain Darren DeShore said, quote, somewhere around the middle there was this orange and red flash coming out. Initially it was just one flash. Then this flash just kept popping all the way around the building. And that building had started to explode. With each popping sound, it was initially an orange, and then a red flash came out of the building, and then it would just go all around the building on both sides as far as I could see. For instance, as far as his eyes could see. These popping sounds and explosions were getting bigger, going both up and down, and then all around the building, unquote. Again, reported by the New York Times in the oral history of Karen DeShore, page 15. Firefighter Richard Banakiski gave this testimony, quote, there was just an explosion. It seemed like on television when they blow up these buildings. It seemed like it was going all the way around like a belt. All these explosions, unquote. Again, from the New York Times, the oral history of Richard Banakiski, page 3 and 4. Deputy Commissioner Thomas Fitzpatrick corroborates, quote, it looked like sparkling around one specific layer of the building. My initial reaction was that this was exactly the way it looks when they show you those implosions on TV. Again, New York Times, Oral History of Thomas Fitzpatrick, page 13 and 14. Reader, we have just read what the lawyers call corroboration evidence, which evidence suggests explosives were used to demolish the towers. Under the subtitle, Steel Beams Ejected from the World Trade Center Buildings, the author writes, two other strange phenomena that supports the planned demolition as opposed to a fire collapse was the horizontal ejection of structural steel members for hundreds of feet and the pulverization of concrete to a flour-like powder observed in the collapses of the World Trade Center towers. These two phenomena are suggestive of the use of high explosives, as well explained in the article on this web page. And then it gives a citation at the bottom of the page. Under the subtitle, Synchronized Explosions, he says, several eyewitnesses said that the explosions they heard and the flashings or poppings they saw and observed seemed to have been synchronized. Firefighter Kenneth Rogers says, quote, there was an explosion in the South Tower. I kept watching, floor after floor after floor, one floor under another after another. It looked like a synchronized, deliberate kind of thing, unquote. From the oral history of Kenneth Rogers, published by the New York Times, page 3 and 4. Why were none of these eyewitness reports by firefighters and medical workers suggestive of a controlled demolition made known to the public and dismissed in the official government 9/11 report? One witness, Auxiliary Lieutenant Fireman Paul Isaacs, said, quote, there were definitely bombs in those buildings. Many other firemen knew there were bombs in the buildings, but they're afraid of their jobs to admit it because the quote-unquote higher-ups forbid discussion of this fact, unquote. The question that arises is, how could anyone not having control of the World Trade Center get in to plant explosives on all those floors? How could anyone wanting to plant explosives in the World Trade Center towers have gotten through the security, especially through CIA security in building number 7? What security company had the contract to secure and guard these buildings, and why has this company not been held to account for allowing quote-unquote terrorists to get through their security checks in 3 different World Trade Center buildings? The answer is simple. The security company with the contract for the World Trade Center buildings, now called Stratesec, was called Securicom. Between 1993 and 2000, when Securicom installed a new security system in all three of the World Trade Center buildings, Marvin Bush, the brother of President George W. Bush Jr., was one of the company's directors. And as if by some strange chance of fate, from 1999 until January of 2002, President Bush's cousin, Wirt Walker III, was Chief Executive Officer of Securicom, also known as Stratesec. No wonder these facts did not make it onto the screen of our evening news, nor indeed into the 9/11 Commission report. Cover up? What do you think? Here's another salient fact that speaks for itself. Building number 7, which was not hit by any airplane, took just 6.5 seconds to collapse. That's a building of 47 floors collapsing in less than 7 seconds and never being hit by any plane. The government recycled the steel before any analysis could be done to verify its alleged steel failure theory. NBC News reporter Pat Dawson, who was close to the scene of the attacks, reported live to his television newsroom anchor, on his television newsroom anchor, said this, quote, "Just moments ago, I spoke to the chief of fire safety for the New York Fire Department, Chief Albert Curry. He received word of another secondary device." And here he interrupts his statement to say, "That's another bomb going off." And then he continues, quote, "He, that is the fire chief, tried to get his men out as quickly as he could, but he said that there was another explosion which took place, and then an hour after the first hit, the fire chief said that was another explosion that took place in one of the towers here. He thinks that there were actually devices planted inside the building," unquote. Another witness, a 9/11 survivor, said in his testimony, quote, "There was a big explosion here. All of a sudden, the elevator blew up. Smoke. I dragged a guy out. His skin was hanging off. I dragged him and I helped him out, and I helped him to the ambulance," unquote. Yet another said, quote, "I came from the 8th floor. Big explosion. Just blew us back into the 8th floor. Just got out of the car, that is the subway car that he was traveling to underneath the World Trade Center, and it blew," unquote. "The subway car?" asked the NBC reporter. "Yeah," replied the survivor. A news reporter on the scene, Pat Dawson, for either Fox News or NBC, told his newsroom television anchor, quote, "We understand that there's been a secondary explosion on Tower 2, unquote. Still another eyewitness, a World Trade Center employee, said in testimony, quote, "There was a big explosion coming down." And then he gives the example while he was coming down from the World Trade Center building. He continues, "Everything just got black. Glass started popping. Everything grew dark. Real dark," unquote. David Lee of WCBS, Fox News affiliate, said, quote, "Just seconds ago, there was a second explosion, and it appears now that building number 2 has collapsed," unquote. 5 minutes prior to this, a policewoman was seen and heard saying that building 2, that is the second tower, was going to collapse. Quote, "Someone on the radio, get out of the area. They say the second tower is coming down," unquote. A CNN eyewitness, Kevin McNeil, a World Trade Center employee, said, quote, "Bomb after bomb went off. It was like holy hell coming down those stairs. Then, when we got to the bottom, we were coming down at near the mezzanine level, and another explosion sent everyone flying. Right in front of me, everything just went boom, unquote. Reporter Ann Thompson on site said, quote, at 10:30 a.m., I tried to leave the building, but I came outside. But as I came outside, I heard a second explosive and another rumble and more smoke and more dust. I ran inside the building. The chandelier shook and we were covered in more dust. And then a fire marshal came and said we had to leave because if there's a third explosion, this building might not last, unquote. This was reported by MSNBC. Craig Carlson said that he and other firefighters, quote, heard explosions coming from the South Tower. There were about 10 explosions. We then realized the building started to come down, unquote. Again, New York Times, Carlson's oral testimony, pages 5 and 6. Firefighter Joseph Miola said, quote, it looked like the building was blowing out on all four sides. We actually heard the pops, unquote. Again, New York Times, Miola, page 5. Paramedic Daniel Rivera also reported that he heard explosions. When asked how he knew that the South Tower was coming down, he said, quote, at first I thought it was. Do you ever see professional demolition where they set the charges on certain floors and then you hear pop, 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 pop? I thought it was that, unquote. New York Times, Rivera, page 9. Another witness, Timothy Burke, said that, quote, the building popped lower than the fire. I was going, oh my God, there's a secondary device because the way the building popped. I thought it was an explosion, unquote. Burke, page 8 and 9. NBC reporter Rick Sanchez, quote, that would put us a block and a half away from the site of where the explosion was. I spoke with some police officials moments ago, Chris, and they told me that they have reason to believe that one of the explosions at the World Trade Center may have been caused by a van that was parked in the building that may have had some type of explosive device in it, unquote. MSNBC, September 11, 2001. Firefighter Edward Kachia, in his testimony, reported, quote, it actually gave at a lower floor, not the floor where the plane hit. We originally had thought that there was an internal detonation, explosives, because it went in succession, boom, 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 and then the tower came down, unquote. New York Times, Kachia, page 5. The significance of these first-hand observations? They refute the official government National Institute of Science and Technology report, which claimed to have found no corroborative evidence suggesting that the World Trade Center towers were brought down by controlled demolition using explosives planted prior to September 11, 2001, unquote. Rather, the government-sponsored NIST report says, quote, photos and videos from several angles clearly showed that the collapse initiated at the fire and impact floors and that the collapse progressed from the initiating floors downward, unquote. No corroborating evidence? If all the eyewitnesses' reports above, and there are many more like them with no agenda and no reason to invent stories of poppings, bombings, and sounds of explosions, are not corroborative evidence, then the word has no meaning. Take another eyewitness, a Fox News anchor, speaking at the start of the collapse of the South Tower. Quote, there's an explosion at the base of the building. White smoke from the bottom. Something happened at the at the base of the building. Then another explosion, unquote. This was reported at 9:59 a.m. on WNYW Fox 5, whose anchor was describing the first seconds of the collapse of the World Trade Center. Firefighter Edward Kachia reported independently, and I repeat, says the author, for corroboration, if you please, quote, "We thought there was like an internal detonation, explosives, because it went in succession. Boom, 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 and then the tower came down. It actually gave at a lower floor, not the floor where the plane hit." Unquote, from the oral history of Edward Kachia, New York Fire Department. There you have it, reader. The collapse began below the strike zone and the fire zone, as reported firsthand by the firefighters and fire chiefs who were actually there. No conspiracy theory here. What more proof do you want? Sure, no one can say with 100% certainty that it was an inside job, but it sure does look and sound like one. But of course, some will maintain that all of history is merely one string of accidents after another. Oh, and if it was an inside job, who was behind it? Do I need to tell you? I'll let you come to your own conclusion, but allow me to draw your attention to the following statement by the now deceased Jesuit professor Malachi Martin. In 1991, Malachi Martin wrote on behalf of Pope John Paul II that the Pope knows, quote, that human catastrophe on a world scale is impending. He knows some of the horrific details of that worldwide catastrophe. He knows it will come without prior warning. He knows that only a minority will recognize it for what it is and make preparation for the tribulation that will follow, unquote. From The Keys of This Blood, page 657. How does the Pope know details of these things? Did he know of the impending events of 9/11 and its worldwide repercussions? Did he know of the financial crisis that is now shaking up all nations? And what is the, quote, tribulation that will follow, unquote? Could it be that the popes know these things in advance because they orchestrate them? Perhaps also 9/11 was just the first wave of a new crusade. I say here perhaps. We shall have to answer that one. 9/11 was an inside job. It was conducted by Roman Catholics placed high in our government with the foreknowledge of the papacy, initiating the cosmic changes that are ongoing in this country, transforming America into the image of the beast. There is a tribulation coming, but it's not God that's causing the tribulation. It's the Pope of Rome. Now, chapter 60 of the book is entitled, Fascism Comes to America, Antichrist in the United States of America. And it begins with a quote from H.G. Wells. Plainly, the thesis is that history must now continue to be a string of accidents with an increasingly disastrous trend until a comprehensive faith in the modernized world state, socialistic, cosmopolitan, and creative, takes hold of the human imagination. From his work entitled The Shape of Things to Come, again by H.G. Wells, published in 1933. Here's a quote from Thomas E. Watson, who said, Roman Catholicism threatens the very foundation of our institutions, strikes at the very root of our liberties, unquote. P.D. Stewart begins by saying, supremacy in America is the aim of popery. In 1935, Sinclair Lewis, a Nobel Prize-winning author, wrote prophetically in his 15th novel entitled It Can't Happen Here, quote, "When fascism comes to America, it will be wrapped in the flag and carrying the cross," unquote. What did he mean? The Republican government of the United States is a form of government that the first of all true Republican governments that affords the widest liberty and the greatest freedom to man. It was part of the providence of God that the forefathers of that great nation should leave the old world dominated by the Roman Catholic Church to come to the North American continent. It is beyond question that God himself had a hand in the establishment of the United States of America and in its form of government. And he inspired the framers of the U.S. Constitution to lay the foundation for the certainty of liberties of its people. But the power that ruled the old world would not have her influence undermined by this new nation that grew up like a lamb and began as strong as a lion. From its inception, the great historic power in the old world of Europe sought to insinuate itself into the affairs and government of America. In his 1949 book, The Vatican in World Politics, Avro Manhattan wrote concerning the activities of one Father Charles L. Coughlin, the radio priest as he was known. In this important book, the author gives us a clue as to the moves we can expect from Rome in America. Quote, "The Vatican designs to conquer the United States of America, not only as such, but also as the leader of the Americas and the potential leader of America," unquote. Avro Manhattan explains how this was to be achieved through social justice. The buzzword, the very buzzword used by President Barack Obama and the Pope. Here's the quote. Father Coughlin had thousands of readers of his paper, Social Justice, and millions of listeners to his broadcasts. What did he preach? He simply preached the kind of authoritarianism combined with a mixture of fascism and Nazism harmonized. He bore in mind that the country in question was the United States of America. Father Coughlin, in fact, tried to use non-Catholic elements which nevertheless had in common with Catholicism and with him the same hatred of certain things and the same goals in social and political matters. By skillful maneuvering, he managed to secure a majority control of 80% of quote-unquote America First, an organization formed mainly by supranationalist elements and business magnates, unquote. Father Coughlin's influence on Depression-era America was enormous. Millions of Americans listened to his weekly radio broadcast on social justice. It is said that, quote, at the height of his popularity, 1/3 of the nation was tuned into his weekly broadcasts. In the early 1930s, Coughlin was arguably one of the most influential men in America, unquote. Note, therefore, that like Coughlin, President Barack Obama is big on social justice and even has a department called Social Justice Ministry for Obama. His own pre-election website states, quote, Social Justice Ministry is a group for small people of all faiths, is a group for people of all faiths and beliefs ready, willing, and able to come together and elect Senator Obama as the next President of the United States, unquote. We're coming up on the end of the program. Don't forget, Barack Obama was Jesuit trained in Chicago by Gregory Galuzzo, a Jesuit priest. He was profoundly affected by John Paul II's teaching on social justice. He was put in the White House by his Roman Catholic controllers, and he's been implementing Roman Catholic social justice better known as the redistribution of our wealth. He serves the Pope, not the people. We'll continue tomorrow on Inquisition Update.